the political importance of the issue of history, the way in which history is being distorted, and a new kind of history is being imposed on students, on universities, and is circulating on WhatsApp. But this is not something new. This has been part of the sanghparivar agenda right since the beginning, at least for 100 years, but even longer. Because many of the ideas, many of the distortions of history are views which began to be presented right from the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Particularly the idea that India as a nation belongs only to one community, which has been living in India for time immemorial. And it is with that kind of understanding that people belonging to other religious faiths are declared as outsiders, as foreigners. And I will spend a few minutes speaking about this issue because it is so important to the way in which the sanghparivar defines the Indian nation. A few months ago, the Prime Minister, while speaking in the United Nations, referred to 1,000 years of slavery in India. So what happened in 1947 was the end of 1,000 years of slavery. We know that the British were here for about 200 years. So when you say 1,000 years of slavery, it means 200 years plus another 800 years. So what he is referring to, and he is not the only person who's saying this, others have also said this. Many of these sanghparivar ideologues have written books on this, articles on this, idea of 1,000 years of slavery. What is being said is that for nearly 800 years, foreign rulers, that is Muslims, or rather rulers who were Muslims, ruled over the country, and this was a time of slavery. Now, what is being said is that those who belong to the Islamic faith are really outsiders. And therefore, those who believe in, who have the Islamic belief and who are Muslim, if they rule, that becomes foreign rule. They become outsiders. We should remember that both Islam and Christianity have a very old history in this subcontinent, in India. Kerala. In fact, Kollam itself has some of the oldest churches and mosques. places of worship of Muslims and Christians, some of the oldest, are to be found in Kollam and of course in other neighboring parts of Kerala. You know this better than I do. With a history of 1200 years, 1500 years, 1600 years, in the case of some of these places of worship. So these are religious faiths which have a very, very long presence, a very long history in India, and belong to the subcontinent, belong to India. And I'm talking here of undivided India. They have been present for a very long time, for several centuries. These are people, again, in most writings of the sanghparivar ideologues, and that is the kind of history textbooks, and I will say something about history textbooks that they have been saying. They use the term invader. So Muslim rulers came as invaders, completely ignoring or denying the long history of migrants, of traders, of settlers. Kerala is the most outstanding example of the migration of Muslim traders, Christians, coming to migrating as traders, as scribes, as people engaged in various crafts. In fact, one of the things that happened with this migration was the coming of many new skills, many new crafts came with these migrants. Again, if I was to speak only of the Kerala coast, the very long history that it has of trade with various parts of the world. You're familiar with the excavations which have shown the long history of trade with the Roman Empire, with China. It is this which created what Professor K. Ganesh in a recent speech mentioned as the ensemble of Malayali identity. It is not one identity, many identities have come together. And that is true of this entire subcontinent also. Many people, many identities have come together to create what is an Indian identity. But the way in which this term foreigner gets to be used defines people who belong to certain religious faiths as outsiders. And I'll come back to that point. But before that, let me point out 2 or 3 things that are happening to push through this idea. Because these are things which are being talked about now in school textbooks. Young minds are being poisoned. Those features of our history, of our past, which talk about many cultures, many languages, many religious faiths intermingling, all that is being removed from textbooks. Children in schools will not learn these things. And if state governments decide to go ahead with this, not to remove those textbooks or not to use those textbooks, their funding will be stopped. So textbooks of the of the NCERT, which provides a kind of model for other textbooks in states also, state level textbooks. In recent times, what are the things that have been removed only 2 years ago? So what have they removed? Chapters on the Mughals. I will say something specifically on the Mughals a little later. Lessons which dealt with the early history of Islam, they have been completely removed. The several centuries of the history of Islam, right from Arabia, Central Asia, parts of North Africa, that has been completely removed. There was a very important chapter which discussed partition by showing to students the dangers of communal politics, what communal politics did to the subcontinent in 1947. The way in which communal politics led to partition. That chapter has been removed. And there is a method in all this. The method, the reason, the logic of this is to show, first of all, that India is not a nation comprising several religious communities, linguistic groups, people following different faiths, living in different regions, different patterns of subsistence, different dress, food. Those who do not adhere to a particular lifestyle or a particular religious faith are not therefore Indians. That's one logic of removing such chapters. Another logic is to avoid any mention of communal politics. Because as we all know, the sanghparivar engages aggressively in communal politics, divisive politics. And therefore anything, any chapter or any school book which teaches children about how dangerous communal politics is to be removed. This is the underlying logic of what is happening. But before I go further, let me come back to this issue of foreigners. So, in recent years, one important trend has been to project Mughal rulers as villains, as evil, as bad. And therefore, the entire period of Mughal rule for several centuries was a time of slavery, was a time when people suffered. Why? Because the Mughals were outsiders. Why were they outsiders? Because they were Muslims. Many of the places which were named after Mughals are systematically, their names are being removed. So very well known railway junction in North India, Mughal Sarai, which was a very major railway station, it's still a major railway station. The name was suddenly changed and Mughal Sarai was renamed after a RSS leader. Even some places which had nothing directly to do with the Mughals, like the Mughal gardens in Rashtrapati Bhavan. the name is changed. They were called Mughal gardens because they were designed, after all, everybody knows that the Rashtrapati Bhavan building was built initially for the Viceroy and was designed by a British architect. But that British architect, when he was designing Rashtrapati, when he was designing the Viceroy's palace, included a design for a very magnificent garden. That garden was based upon the principles upon which Mughal gardens were built. That's why it is named Mughal garden. So that was removed. I could give you a long list of other places, other place names which have been changed because they have some association with the Mughals. But I think it is necessary to just think a little about this, attaching this label of foreigner, outsider to the Mughals. Of course, the Mughals created a monarchical state. And like all monarchical states, whether we are talking of southern India, whether we are talking of northern India, central India, kingdoms and empires were monarchical states and they were exploitative states. We can criticize the Mughals as historians in various ways, and Marxist historians, of whom Professor Irfan Habib is the most sort of outstanding, has himself, Marxist historians have looked at the exploitative aspects of the Mughal state. But that is a different thing. What sanghparivar kind of history does is to call them villains only because they happen to be Muslims, or their ancestors migrated from areas outside of India. Now, I think, it is also important to please keep this in mind. This term like foreigner, outsider is a problem for societies of the pre-modern period. Today, when Trump is sending and deporting people, what is he saying? These are illegal migrants. They are illegal migrants who have no documentation. So there are migrants with documentation, but there are also migrants without documentation. What is the documentation? So today, if you want, so who is a foreigner? Somebody who does not have. So if I was talking of, let's say, France, who are foreigners in France? Who do not have a French passport, who do not have French identity papers, who do not have their names on the voters list. This is what makes them an outsider. Similarly for India, similarly for the United States. So the definition of outsider is that documentation. You don't have that documentation, but that documentation itself something very recent. The history of passports is just about 125 years old. Who carried a passport before that? People just migrated. Who had identity cards? Who had names on voters' lists? And political boundaries were not defined in the way they are defined now in the modern period. So please, as historians, when we look at and when we need to have a historical sense, we need to understand that the use of the term foreigner and outsider is also very different when you're talking about the present context. We could discuss this a little more later, but this definition of outsider and foreigner is something, the way it is defined is very, very recent. But let us, just forget that for the time being. And let us look at the Mughal emperors. When we say outsider, foreigner. So let us just take the example of Akbar. Akbar was what today you would call, among migrants, a third generation settler. His grandfather came from Central Asia. He was sort of forced to leave Central Asia, what is parts of what is today Uzbekistan, went to Afghanistan, created a small kingdom for himself, then came to India. I'm talking of Babur. And then created a kingdom in India. Afghanistan remained a part of his kingdom. In fact, Babur was buried in Kabul. Akbar was his grandson. So he becomes a what today you would call a third generation settler. He was born in the Thar desert at a place called Umarkot, very close to Jaisalmer. When his father, Humayun, was in exile. Humayun was Babur's son, Akbar's father, as most of you would know. Humayun had been defeated by Sher Shah. He left India, lived in exile for some time, gathered an army. For what purpose? To be able to come back to India. And he died eventually, Humayun died eventually in Delhi. Those of you have been, if anyone, some of you might have been to Delhi, in the old fort, there is a place where he fell from the steps and died. But if you come to Akbar, he's born in India, dies in India. Jahangir, Akbar's son, was born in Fatehpur Sikri near Agra and died in Lahore. Shah Jahan, builder of Taj Mahal, he was born in Lahore, undivided India, and died in Agra. And those of you who have been to the Taj Mahal would have been shown the grave of Shah Jahan in Taj Mahal. He's buried in Agra. What makes them outsiders? 3 generations, 4 generations, they are all born in India, live in India, die in India. Aurangzeb was born at a place called Dahod in Gujarat. By today's understanding, that would actually make him a Gujarati by birth. He was born in Gujarat, in Dahod. So, and died in what is now today part of Maharashtra. So in other words, these are people whose ancestors might have come from parts of Central Asia several generations earlier, but they were born and died in India. But that is not the only reason why this label of foreigner is a problem. One of the reasons why sanghparivar history avoids reference to British rule, of course, is because they have no role to play in the freedom struggle. So they don't talk about the exploitation by the British. That is real foreign rule. It was foreign rule for a very specific reason. And that reason is the long period for 200 years. First the East India Company, then Britain, took out resources from India and took them to England. What is known as drain of wealth. They are taking wealth from India for 200 years and taking it, transferring it to Britain. That makes it foreign rule. That makes it colonial rule, which is different from the way in which Mughals or other rulers, for instance of the Delhi Sultanate or the other sultanates in southern India, in the Deccan, in Bijapur, in Ahmednagar, in Golconda, in Hyderabad. These were rulers who were Muslim, but they did not engage in that kind of drain of wealth as the British did. I have a little time left, but I just want to make one more reference when we are talking about, this distortion of textbooks and history writing. And maybe Professor K. Ganesh would add to that, because that's really his field, but I do want to say something about that. That for the past few years, public funded institutions like the Indian Council of Historical Research and more importantly the Archaeological Survey of India are engaged in undertaking research and excavations. And excavations are very expensive, so it requires a lot of government funding. They are engaged in excavations to prove that the Indus Valley civilization was a civilization which was created by the Aryans. The accepted historical understanding is that the Aryans migrated into India after the Indus Valley civilization had collapsed. I will not go into technicalities of dates and so on. But that is the understanding which research of the last 100 years or so, Indus Valley civilization itself was discovered about 100 years ago, has established that the Aryans, first of all, that the Aryans migrated, and the genetic evidence now has made it very clear that there was a migration which coincided with the time that the Aryans are supposed to have come to the Indian subcontinent. And the second point, that this migration took place after the Indus Valley civilization had collapsed. After. What this archaeological excavations are trying to do is to prove something which sanghparivar historians have been talking about, so-called historians, because they really have no credentials of historians. For several decades they have been talking about this, that Aryans did not migrate, they are indigenous, they are people from India. They don't even accept the fact that there is an out of Africa migration which resulted in people migrating to different parts of the world. They say that the Aryans are from India and that they created the Indus Valley civilization, even though all evidence is against that. One particular evidence, and I will just sort of mention that and try to conclude. One important evidence is that the Vedic Sanskrit speaking Aryan people, when they migrated to northwestern parts of the subcontinent, they brought with them the horse, which was unknown at that time in the Indian subcontinent, and they brought the horse-drawn chariot with wheels. For a long time, Sanghparivar historians have been trying to say that that since they are the Aryans did not migrate from outside, therefore, and there is no evidence of horse or chariot in the Indus Valley civilization. So historians say that this must have come from outside. That is a problem for Sanghparivar historians. So what are they saying? Now, suddenly, Archaeological Survey of India has announced they have discovered a chariot. Chariot was drawn by horse. Since it was drawn by horse, therefore, horse and chariot were known to the Indus Valley people. And since it was known to the Indus Valley people, therefore, Indus Valley people are also Aryan. I will not go into the technicalities of this, but a large amount of public money is going into these projects which are intended to completely distort history. This program was broadcast on Discovery. It's still available. You can have a look at it. Manoj Bajpayee, the actor, made a long presentation on this. Prime Minister has also spoken as if he's an accomplished historian who can speak on very technical matters relating to the Indus Valley civilization and discovery of horse and chariot and so on. But because it is being spoken in this way, people start then believing that this history is true. This is true history. What historians are saying is false history. And that makes this kind of history writing very, very dangerous. I think now that it is important to keep in mind that, that this is not happening just in the case of ancient India or Indus Valley civilization or the medieval period or the Mughals, but also in the case of the modern period. But for instance, when the NCERT textbooks were making changes in NCERT textbooks, one of the things they did was to remove all references to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. Because those references mentioned the role of communal politics, Sanghparivar, in the assassination of Gandhi and communal forces. That is completely removed. And who are now the great icons of the BJP? Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and Sardar Patel, because they have no icons of their own. So Sardar Patel, who was Home Minister in Nehru's cabinet, in the Congress cabinet, is their great hero. Because they have no heroes of their own. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who had nothing to do with the BJP, who had nothing to do with its earlier incarnation Janasangh, who had nothing to do with the RSS, with the Hindu Mahasabha. He is suddenly the icon of the Sanghparivar, of the BJP, of the right wing. It is important to keep in mind that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, we can have differences with him over many aspects of his politics. But on one issue, he was fully committed to secularism, fully committed to opposing communal politics, which completely goes against the ideology of the BJP and the Sanghparivar. Bhagat Singh is their great hero nowadays. Bhagat Singh is their great hero because Bhagat Singh is used to attack Gandhi, to attack Nehru. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose is used to attack Nehru, to attack Gandhi. Sardar Patel is used to attack Nehru. That is why they are so fond of these people. But not with Bhagat Singh's ideology. His ideology was opposed to communalism. He had embraced socialism. He was drawn to Marxism. And while in jail, he wrote this very important text, Why I Am an Atheist, which is about cultivating scientific temper, completely against the ideology of the sanghparivar. Therefore, the purpose that these people serve is only to attack others, including the communists. And I would like to end by saying that the way to give better understanding of history to children in textbooks is to give them more information about, to have a focus on struggles of the people, struggles of peasants and workers, struggles of Dalits and communists. That is what will give children a better understanding. That is what will give students in colleges, in universities, and all of us, when we understand history, a better understanding of our past, rather than histories which only focus on the fight between Hindus, Muslims, other religious groups, or the fight of rulers against the Mughals. That is not the kind of history which will enrich our understanding of the past. Thank you.